Hello and welcome to Miniatures Rundown. I'm Mitchell, and today we're going to cover the basics of the Tyranids. One of the quintessential factions of Warhammer 40k, one of the most iconic, I feel, other than Space Marines. But we are going to do a quick breakdown of the ins and outs, positives, negatives, and the detachments of the Tyranids, and later we'll cover them in more detail with the individual models rather. So first up, something I don't know a whole lot about, but I can tell you the basics. The lore of the Tyranids. They are the alien faction. A lot of the other ones are aliens, but they're like elves and, robots and blah, blah, blah. But these guys are alien. These guys were born on a planet, have this like hive mind that they follow, and their whole goal is to eat. They go planet to planet with their giant spaceships and devour entire planets, turning it into biomass to make more Tyranids. That's their goal. There is no bigger plans. There is no machinations, centuries in the making, not Tzeentch, not Necrons, not like... They're there to eat and to reproduce to eat. That's it. The planets that they come across that are a little harder for them to take over, maybe they're a little more civilized, maybe they have Space Marines on them, they send the Gene Stealer cults. The Gene Stealer cults is a decades-long plan, but the end goal is to eat the planet. They send the Gene Stealers in order to infiltrate the populace so that the populace is easier to devour. And that's about it. Their whole goal is to eat. I can relate. Up next, we have basically the overview. They have some things that work from the lore into the game. Not every faction is going to have this, but Tyranids does it a little bit. They're extremely diverse. They have, because they've been around so long, they do have a very, very large data sheet set. Not as big as Space Marines. I'm going to say that a lot. But they can do anything that you want. You can have 15 models on the board and have all monsters and go very, very elite. Or you can go the exact opposite side, have 250 models on the board and go really, really heavy swarm. And because of that, you can kind of do anything in between. So if you like a diverse faction, that's not, Knights is always going to have 5 models on the board, 6 models on the board. And Orcs are probably going to have a whole bunch of models on the board. Gene Stealer cult's going to have a whole bunch of models on the board. They can't really go elite heavy. Tyranids can, which is kind of nice. They are adaptive. They're supposed to be literally adaptive, where they see a problem on the battlefield and overcome it with their adaptivity. Doesn't really work like that, but it does have some auras and abilities that you can use to overcome weaknesses like low stats, which we will talk about in a second, being one of their weaknesses. They have things that reduce your opponent's chances to hit or wound. They have things that can reduce your opponent's attacks, increase your strength, your armor saves, reduce their leadership. Like, they have a lot of auras, buffs, and debuffs in order to kind of work together. They adapt with synergy. And that leads us into our first advantage. They are very synergistic. They really like to work off of each other using those abilities that buff. They're also pretty mobile. They aren't the fastest faction, because if you're looking at, Slaanesh is very, very fast. Knights are fast by incident just because they're big. But they have a bunch of different ways to be fast. Generally, their lowest speed is 6, which is, normal. But their normal monsters are speed 8. They can go up to 10. Their big guys can go up to 12. Their flying guys are 12 generally. And they have a lot of ways to get around with that movement. Not necessarily just their move characteristic, but also abilities like infiltrate, scout, deep strike, flying, evasive moves when your opponent gets closer, or moves after you shoot. They play a lot in the setup and movement sections of the game. In with synergy, like I said before, they have overlapping buffs. You can take any usual model or data sheet from the game and buff it to the 9s. You can use your auras and targeted abilities to absolutely wreck one area or one unit that you want to go down. A lot of factions do something like this, but Tyranids do it in more of a overlapping way. But because of that, it leads to our first disadvantage, which is they're generally low stats. Basically, these guys are a kind of a brain teaser. You have all of these overlapping buffs and debuffs, but you need them to be competitive. Like if you send a single exocrine at a tank, it's probably not going to blow it up. Exocrines are very good, but not really at that job. They need buffs from things that reduce armor saves, things that increase your strength, let you reroll, that kind of thing. And they have fixed all of that being overlapping buffs into reducing the general stat lines and damage and strength of all of your units that you can take. They have really low strength, other than, I would say, probably 4 to 6 data sheets. They don't go above strength 10, so strength 11 plus is going to be a problem. Their save is not great because guess what? They're not wearing armor except for chitin, and the chitin is on the big guys. So the really, really big monsters are like a 2-up save, maybe a 4-up invuln if they're a psyker. Other than that, they're probably going to be pretty low saves for max. The last weakness is kind of overwritten by one of their army rules. They have a very low leadership. The best leadership in the faction is a 7. That includes all characters, that includes named characters, everything is a 7. But this is overdone with the army rules. The first and probably most useful army rule is Synapse. It is on a lot of characters, and I will go over those in a second. And what it means is normally when you take a leadership test for Battle Shock, you roll 2d6. For Tyranids, you roll 3d6. That is not 3d6 and take the 2 highest. It is 3d6. The other thing it gives you is a recent addition, which is +1 strength while you're in melee, which does lean Tyranids a little more towards melee, but their guns can also be very strong. The leadership buff is an absolute must-have. There is nothing in your faction that doesn't want it, and you're really, really going to feel it if you don't have it. I would definitely put quite a few Synapse units in the faction and try and keep them in your Synapse bubble as much as you can, just because if you go below half strength, you're going to feel not being in that bubble with your 7-up max. I believe 8-up is most of the faction, and I think there's a couple of 9s. The strength buff, on the other hand, like I said, it does lean the faction more towards melee, but not everybody is going to need the melee. Like if you take, as I said before, an Exocrine or a Tyrannifex or something, they don't really want to be in combat. I mean, they can, but the +1 strength in melee is not really going to affect them very much. And then we have the characters that have the Synapse buff. There are characters and regular units that have it, and I will put those on the screen somewhere, but I'll read them off as well. The Broodlord, all versions of the Hive Tyrant, so the Hive Tyrant, the Swarm Lord, and the Winged Hive Tyrant. The Neuro Tyrant, the Parasite of Mortex, which I believe was just added recently. The Turvagon and the Winged Tyranid Prime are the characters that have Synapse, and they really want to be kind of supporting your units. The Swarm Lord in particular has a 9-inch range for Synapse, and the Neuro Tyrant can give Synapse to 2 units that are within 18 inches, so they count as being in it even if they're not within 6. So those can both be very helpful in keeping you in Synapse. The non-characters that have Synapse are basically the Psychers. The Maliceptor, Neurolictor, Norn Assimilator, and Emissary. Warriors, both melee and ranged versions. I don't know why that is. I'm not a lore guy. And Zoanthropes, who are the premier psychic bug. They all have Synapse, and they can help kind of shore up your weaknesses if you put like a unit of Tyranid warriors behind your Hormagaunts in order to keep them from losing their leadership. The second part of the abilities on the army is the Shadow in the Warp. It is a once per game ability that you can use in either hero's command phase, and what it does is it makes every enemy unit take a Battle Shock test. That's it. They get -1 to that test if they're within 6 inches of a Synapse model, so if they're in your Synapse range. And the Neuro Tyrant gives an extra -1 if it's on the board from anywhere on the board. So the Neuro Tyrant is a pretty good include, especially since it's really easy to find because it was in Leviathan. Now, if a unit is already below half, it doesn't have to take 2 tests. So it's not 1 for Shadow and 1 for regular Battle Shock. They did cover that in an FAQ. This army rule has always been a little strange to me. It can be very wishy-washy. It can be absolutely clutch and score the game for you, make your opponent unable to do what they needed to do or unable to score in their turn, or they could pass all their Battle Shock tests and do absolutely nothing, or anywhere in between. So since it is random, your opponent can buff it with whatever, it can be difficult to use effectively unless the game at the moment utilizes it being used in your phase. It should be used in your opponent's command phase. It stops the scoring of primary since it happens in the command phase before primary is scored. It stops the use of offensive strats like rerolling or, you know, run and charge or whatnot. It also stops actions, which is a huge deal. Because if they get two action secondaries, or they're playing tactical and they have action secondaries, they just can't do them. They really have to work around what they can do. But again, it's random what passes and what doesn't. In your turn, all it really does is it makes you taking an objective from them easier. So if you're both on the same objective, you could take it from them, and it stops defensive strats like, you know, feel no pains or +1 armor or fight last or whatnot. It can be good, but stopping the primary scoring is the main reason to use it, in my opinion. And lastly, we're going to cover the detachments that they have. They do have their codex out, so they have quite a few detachments, plus the Grotmus detachment, which I will cover all here. The first one is Invasion Fleet. It is your quintessential all-rounder. It was the one in the index, so it was supposed to cover the widest swath. Like I said, Tyranids is a very varied faction. You can go super heavy or super light on your big bugs, but this is everybody gets a buff. What happens is you pick one of 3 effects, either sustained hits 1 on infantry and swarms, lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or precision on crits. Precision on crits is significantly more niche because it really only helps against characters, but there is a stratagem in the faction that lets you put it on a unit and adapt to be able to either snipe out a character, or if you're using sustained hits because your opponent has mostly infantry, you can, you know, swap into the lethal hits if you would need to take out a knight or something. Up next is the Crusher Stampede. It is Monster Mash. It is big bugs, and it is big bugs getting buffs. So basically, they get a buff depending on how damaged they are. An undamaged monster gets a buff to their control score, which is great. A damaged but above half, so if you've taken any damage, you get +1 to hit, and if you're damaged and below half, you also get +1 to wounds. So you get both if you're almost dead. It can be hard to get there because it does depend on how much damage your opponents deal to you. It's kind of the Necron's problem that if your opponent just takes one model off the board, you get no buffs. But there can be some incidental damage that leave you guys alive, but buffed. Next up is the Unending Swarm, the Gaunt Carpet, as they call it. Basically, it's all the little guys. It is Termagants, Hormagaunts, the Neurogaunts, and the Gargoyles are the 4 that get very buff from this one. They unfortunately did get a pretty heavy nerf from Astray, being that this detachment wasn't very good, and then they got nerfed because there was another faction. There's another faction that had something similar that was. They have a stratagem that lets you, for 2 CP, bring a unit, an Unending Swarm unit back once it's killed. They have errated that so that it's only once per game. So that turns the Unending Swarm into an Ending Swarm. You only got one. The buff that they get, every time one of the 4 units that I said before take any damage, they can surge move D6, and it can end them in melee. It can be very strong for control in that if, you know, you have a unit directly in front of you and they're on a point and you're not, and they shoot you, you're on the point now. It is a very thinky detachment, despite being a bunch of little guys that can swarm the opponent. You're not going to deal a whole lot of damage, but you're going to score. Next is one that got fairly buffed recently, is the Assimilation Swarm. I call this one the Fleshy Necrons. It's all about toughness and healing and reviving models. So your guys go down, but they get back up. It does only revive warrior models. So Maleceptors, your Hive Tyrants are not going to get healed. They're not going to get revived, but they can get healed. What it is there are a certain set of units that have the Devour keyword. And if you're near them, each one of them can heal D3 +1 wounds or revive a warrior model, or D3 warrior models if you're one of the little Gribblies. It's, as I said earlier, kind of it's the Necron's problem. If your opponent takes out a whole unit and damages nothing else, you get no buff. But also there are some ways to kind of prevent that from happening, because this is all about toughness. Next is a familiar sight. It is the Vanguard Onslaught. It is stealthy, using their speed and teleporting and the ability stealth to score get off the board, come back on the board, and make sure that your opponent can't take you out. It's not necessarily about dealing damage, but about scoring the game and making sure that you don't die in the meantime. The buff that the detachment gives you is an interesting one. Despite being all about stealthy and movement, they kind of, all it really does is it gives your vanguard models, so anything that has wings and then anything that has like stealth or infiltrate or whatnot, it lets them fall back in charge and advance in charge. So the charge is more about the movement than it is about the damage dealing. None of these things, except for a few exceptions like the Winged Hive Tyrant, the Gene Stealers, probably, they're not really going to really deal any damage. You're moving to get onto a point or to get further away from an opponent that could kill you. So it's interesting that the detachment ability is about combat, but not really about combat. Last but not least, for the Codex detachments, we have the Synaptic Nexus. It uses, so the way that the faction buffs everything that's around it or in it, this does it times 10. So your buff is chosen at the start of the battle round. You have 3 different buffs that you can choose from, and you can't pick the same one more than once in a game. Though, like the Invasion Fleet detachment, there is a way to give it to a unit despite you not picking it. So if you want one of the buffs in a specific place, you can do that. The 3 buffs are a 5-up invuln on your whole army, which is very, very strong. A +1 to hit, but only in melee, so it kind of leans a little more towards melee. And then +1 to your advances and charges. So those can be very useful in a variety of different ways, and being able to pick which one you want at the time you need it. The downside is very similar to some of the Space Marine options is you can only choose each one once per game. So you can't have a 5-up invuln all the time. You get it once, and then you got to use something else. So it does take a little bit of reactive planning, knowing when you're going to need the +1, knowing when you're going to need the invuln, in order to really take advantage of what you have. It is very, very strong in the buffs that they give. One of the stratagems is use every single turn. You get to pick an enemy unit and then a synapse unit, and all friendly units within 6 inches of that synapse unit get reroll 1s to hit on the target unit. So that is, I need that enemy unit dead. Here's how you kill it. It is a very strong buff, and it can be very, very good. It is one of the ones that sees the most play, besides the base detachment of Invasion Fleet. And very lastly, we have the Warrior Bioform Onslaught, which is the Grotmist detachment. As you could probably guess from the name, it is all about the warriors. The warriors with melee weapons and ranged weapons, and buffs for those. There are a few things that let you buff non-warriors, mainly the little Gribblies, so the Endless Swarm units that are near your warriors, but there's also buffs to like ranged attacks or buffs to you staying on objectives. What the detachment gives you is it, first of all, lets you have warriors as battle line units, which only really matters if you have more than 3 units of one or the other, and it gives warriors OC3 on objectives, which can be very, very hard to move. Especially when you buff them with some defensive shenanigans. Defensive shenanigans, including the other ability of the detachment, which is your warriors and Winged Tyranid primes have a 5-up invuln. So it will help keep them alive to an extent. They normally have a 4-up armor save. Going to a 5-up invuln is, decent, but not the best. And the Winged Tyranid prime can go in gargoyles, which also gives them the invuln, which is pretty strong. Unfortunately, the gargoyles don't really get too much benefits from them other than that, but you're probably going to want to take some gargoyles anyway, which we will talk about in the next video. That is it for Tyranids. I've just gone over the super basics, and of course, I am not the end-all be-all. If I got anything wrong, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, bye.